It is an honour and a privilege to introduce him to you tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, David Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that excessively flattering introduction. Start with an apology. All of you are properly dressed and I am not. But this is not a Gordon Brown moment. It's simply that I had to come straight from work, as did Connor with me. So please forgive me that. Secondly, I'm not going to speak about Brexit this evening, although when you come to questions, I'm sure you'll want to ask one or two issues. Part of the reason is I wrote this speech at least 5 days ago, and it would have been completely out of date by now. But I wanted to talk about other aspects of Thatcherism, other implications of Thatcherism for the modern age, and so that's what I've focused on. So forgive me for that, but don't be too disappointed. We'll have lots of time for questions at the end. I have an absolutely infinite evening in front of me, so my time is yours. Now, I should start by saying I first met Margaret Thatcher when I was in my early 20s. Regrettably a long time ago. She was Secretary of State for Education, and I was a Conservative student leader. They were very different times. Very few people in this room will remember them. Very, very different times. The country was in a parlous state. At home, industrial unrest was rife. Strikes were common. Economic growth was weak. Inflation was high. Abroad, there was an existential nuclear threat from a powerful communist bloc led by the Soviet Union. The intellectual framework of the times was a sort of Keynesian collectivism. The zeitgeist of the day was, to put it mildly, defeatist. The presumption was that capitalism was flawed and the ideas of socialism would eventually succeed, eventually prevail. The British ruling class was particularly defeatist and thought that its job was the management of decline. Now I think about it, perhaps not so different times. And that prevailing presumption of failure seemed to have an iron grip. President Kennedy, not somebody I suspect is quoted in this group very often, but President Kennedy once said, "The great enemy of the truth is very often not the lie, deliberate, contrived and dishonest, but the myth, persistent, persuasive and unrealistic. Too often we hold fast to the cliches of our forebears. We subject all facts to a prefabricated set of interpretations. We enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought." And I'm not actually talking about Brexit, but you know, it may have a resonance. The conventional wisdom of those days was too often a comfortable and convenient apathy. But that, in 1975, was set to change. Margaret Thatcher took the leadership of the Conservative Party. And she saw what everybody else saw, but she thought what nobody else thought. She took a country, the sick man of Europe, and turned it into the envy of the world. That was not a hyperbole. We were copied by the rest of the world. And to do that, she used an amalgam of her formidable intellect with both scientific and legal training. I can match half of that. A strategic boldness, but a tactical caution, and a courage and conviction that is all too rare in modern politics. So when looking at modern problems, I often apply what I call the WWMD rule. It's not weapons of mass destruction, not quite. It's what would Margaret do? It's a useful test even today. And I'm not here talking about Brexit. I know exactly what her response to the Prime Minister's proposed European deal would be. To coin a phrase, no, no, no. Yes? If she ever had to choose between the British establishment and the British people, she would always choose the people. Yeah? What people forget, however, is that Margaret was a formidable election winner. She fought 3 general elections and she won 3 general elections. She did that because she understood the wants and desires of the ordinary people of this country. She was a meritocrat. She believed that people should be able to get on based on their talent, their hard work, and their courage. She absolutely believed in Churchill's description of a good society, one in which there's absolutely no limit to which any man might climb, but a limit beneath which no man might fall. And with that formidable insight, she would have looked at the result of the last election and asked herself, why did we lose a 21.5% opinion poll lead? Huh? She would have ignored the fashionable explanations and looked at the hard facts. In particular, she would observe that we lost the votes not just of the younger voters, but also of the 30 to 45-year-olds. And she would have asked, why? To her, the answer would have leapt out. We did not offer a compelling vision to that generation, let alone one that dealt with the problems and disappointments that they face. As Conservatives, we believe in meritocracy. We believe in social mobility. We believe in opportunity for everybody, no matter where they come from. And as well, we believe in a property-owning democracy. When I was a student, it was widely accepted that Britain offered exactly that. Large numbers of working-class boys and girls grew up to fill roles at the top of society. One boy from my grammar school in working-class South London became the head of the civil service. Another became the England rugby captain. Oh, and one actually became a cabinet minister. Everything was possible. Everything was possible. At a more day-to-day level, every council house tenant could buy their own home. Every family in the country was encouraged to own shares, to buy and own shares. At every level, individual opportunity and social mobility was a reality. Today, I'm afraid, that is certainly not true. Whether you take reports from the OECD, the Brookings Institute, or the Sutton Trust, the story is the same. Britain today has the lowest levels of social mobility across the entire OECD. Social mobility in Australia and Canada is about twice that in the United Kingdom. In Europe, we come bottom of the league. This is what I found most hard to understand. In Europe, we come bottom of the league. We are equal with Portugal. This is not just a statistic. These numbers. For the 21 to 45 age group, it has real and practical meaning. They know what the hurdles to social mobility are because they know what the barriers are to their own aspirations. It starts young, of course. The first barriers to making your own way in life are chaotic early lives. Whether it's growing up in a home in a dependency environment engendered by a poorly designed welfare system, or whether it's unruly streets dominated by crime. It goes on with an education system, whatever we claim in government, that still does a poor job of delivering opportunities to the poorest in our society. It continues with starting work, sometimes carrying the burden of a student loan in a non-graduate job and struggling to buy a home or meeting spectacularly high rents. It's little wonder that the voters looked elsewhere at the general election, when in addition to all of this, we threatened to take away their free school meals and confiscate their inheritance. So let me start with what the answer is not. Let me start with what the answer is not. The way we help the young is not by punishing the old. That somehow we should intervene as a state by increasing taxation on the elderly to redistribute it somehow to the young. This is the instinctive reaction of people who think the role of the state is to take the economic pie and divide it in a different way to suit the political imperative of the day. Conservatives should think about how to increase the size of the pie, not how it's divided up. Yeah. Now let me briefly touch on some of the answers. I'm just going to touch the headlines, really, of a few of the answers of what happens with social mobility when it's real, when it's not a statistic, when it's actually your life, your disappointments, your ambitions, your frustrations, your aims. What actually does it mean in reality? Well, let's start with the first thing that we're doing right, and that's the introduction of universal credit. That policy, pioneered almost single-handedly by Ian Duncan Smith, is the right answer because it sets out to make it always worthwhile getting a job. Always, no matter how low your pay is, no matter how lowly you are in society, always worthwhile getting a job. My one comment on that is the government should fund it properly and not let the greatest reform of the welfare state in modern times be crippled by short-term financial penny pinching. And that, I think, is an important part of what we're doing. And Ian resigned over it, but there's an important principle that we lost in the midst of time if we're not careful. We've got to get that right. Similarly, with respect to crime, we should not penny pinch on our police forces. I remember talking to a Labour Member of Parliament some time ago about the state of his council estates, about the state of the poorer parts of his constituency. He recounted how boys and girls as young as 12 could make £30 a day by delivering drugs for the drug dealers. Today we see that story repeated with criminal gangs recruiting at even younger ages. The disruption this visits on the young is beyond belief. If you start life delivering drugs, the odds are you'll end up on drugs. The Treasury's approach to cutting police expenditure is, in my judgment, a very serious error of judgment. Even from a purely economic point of view, even the lowliest criminal over a lifetime of crime will cost society about £1 million. It's not added up in the national accounts, it doesn't show anywhere. It doesn't mean it's not real. So we shouldn't penny pinch, be penny wise and pound foolish. Putting that to one side, however, the damage to individual and community and the destruction of people's life opportunities are distinctly unconservative things to do. Law and order was always important to Margaret Thatcher. She knew if we can deter young people from turning to crime in the first place, their opportunities are boundless. That's what conservatism's about. So once we have decent homes and crime-free estates, we still have to provide decent schooling for everybody. Today, by the age of 15, the poorest children are 2.5 years behind the children from the richest homes. So we still haven't fixed this problem. And it doesn't have to happen. We may think, oh, this is a rule of nature, this is a law of the world. It doesn't have to happen. Countries as diverse as Estonia, Vietnam, and Hong Kong all do better than we do. They make sure that youngsters from all parts of society get the best outcome, and we can do the same. It's too brief a lecture today for me to talk about grammar schools, which, had they been retained in their original form and in their original numbers, would have continued to be a motor for social mobility, would have. But today their numbers are being cut back so much, they become such a scarcity, such a scarce commodity, that they, of course, have become the monopoly of the middle class in many areas, doing exactly the opposite of what they're intended to do. That's the problem there. Now, if I were to design the classrooms today, I wouldn't start where we are now. With the availability of tablets, modern-day database systems, with easy access to online media, we can take lessons from the best teachers in the world for all our classes if we want to, a mere finger tap away. This can be bolstered with assistance, guidance and aid from qualified classroom teachers. The grammar schools of tomorrow will be virtual grammar schools. The academic streaming of tomorrow will not be limited by location. As I say, I don't have time today to talk about that. That's a 2-hour lecture in its own right, so we'll put it off. But the academic selective education tomorrow will transcend location. You mark my words. But that, of course, brings me to universities. The last couple of decades, we have persuaded whole generations of young people that their only future is via a university-style education. We've expanded the universities dramatically. And to fund that expansion, introduced tuition fees and student loans. We persuaded ourselves that this was a market solution to the provision of higher education. I submit to you it's anything but. Virtually all universities charge the maximum fee, irrespective of value, quality or cost. We charge the same for historical and philosophical studies as we do for medicine and physical sciences, even though the latter requires twice the lecture time and many, many times the resources in terms of laboratories and resources. We charge the same for Oxford and Cambridge courses as we do for the least competitive universities. Since I'm being filmed, I won't name them, but they are there. We charge the same for universities that deliver very high levels of employment and salary as we do for universities where you are likely to come out as in non-graduate employment or even unemployed. This is not a marketplace solution. This is an oppressive monopoly. Very important for us as Conservatives to understand the distinction. Its consequence is that students are leaving university burdened with £50,000 in debt, typically, and uncertain prospects, for the privilege of paying vice-chancellors at comparatively modest colleges over £400,000 a year. Policy is also a financial deceit. In 2017, the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimated 83% of graduates would not fully repay their loans. Every year, tens of millions of pounds of the student loans are written off. Nevertheless, students, graduates, carry the psychological burden of those loans throughout their 20s and 30s. This is not an optimal policy. If the government were a private company, the auditors would require it to write off a large proportion of the loans simply because they would never be repaid. Frankly, the government should do the same and convert to a graduate contribution system that does not bite until a graduate has to pay higher rate tax. It seemed to me perfectly reasonable that a graduate that's made a career on the back of his graduation or on the back of his education should pay for that when it delivers, but not before. Perhaps more importantly, we should require universities to demonstrate and apply some value for money criterion in the level of fees they charge. There is no excuse for, I'm watching the camera, Bedford University to charge the same as Cambridge University. There really isn't. Now, it's too expensive to abolish the system and make the sort of silly promises that Corbyn made, but it's long past time. We made it fairer, better value for money, and a better method for getting on in life. Again, back to social mobility. The next big stage in life used to be getting a job and buying a house. I'll return to employment in a moment. However, in my day, at least 65% of my generation expected to buy their own home. 65%. Today, that number is about 25%. And in London, within 20 miles of here, it's much, much lower still. Those who cannot buy their homes typically spend more than half of their salary on rent. For ordinary people, we have a completely broken housing market. Our planning structures and decisions have failed to keep up with the sharp increase in our population, driven, I have to say, in part by immigration. House prices have grown about 7 times as fast as net family incomes. This has encouraged speculative behaviour on the part of house builders, understandable given where they are, and a strong suspicion that they manage their land banks to maximise their capital gains by creating artificial shortages. The current planning and building regulation mechanisms have left us with homes that are smaller than almost anywhere else in Europe. They're actually half the size of the homes built in the 1950s, half the size. And of course, fewer homes than ever built with gardens. The shortfall in homes is enormous, and we need a radical change in policy. What we need is a new Towns Act that empowers local authorities to develop garden villages, probably between 1,500 and 5,000 homes. This range of size would justify actually viable, I suppose the modern world is sustainable, but I tend not to use it, viable villages with primary schools, local shops, a bus service, broadband, and if they're at the bigger end of the scale, secondary schools and other facilities. Designation of such villages would lead to massive increases in nominal land value. An acre of farmland is typically, I think in the south and Midlands of England, worth about £12,000 an acre. If we renominated that as a garden village, it'd be worth £1 million an acre. That is a windfall gain that the farmer or whoever it is that owns it has done nothing to acquire. So I see no reason why we shouldn't say half of that gain goes to the farmer, reasonably, tax-free probably. But the other half, because they never pay taxes because they roll it over, that's another issue. But the half that goes to the farmer, and the other half goes to the would-be buyer. Not to the speculative builder, but the would-be buyer. And we set up an auction system so that we get decent houses for those people. Much cheaper than we would get them now. Much cheaper than we get them now. That can be done by auction arrangements. And affordable houses, by the way, in that context, will be provided without making them tiny boxes. Because that's what we do today. Go look at what affordable houses look like. Tiny boxes. If every English rural authority built a garden village along those lines, it would amount to about 1 million new homes. That's what we're talking about, 1 million new homes. A completely different approach to house building, home provision in this country. It's that sort of radical, Gordian knot cutting exercise that I'd expected Margaret to look at if she were trying to solve this problem today. But it's just one idea. There are many others which we consider in return to our conservative model of a property-owned democracy. We should certainly extend the right to buy to housing corporations, housing associations. We have played with this as a party over the years. When I was chairman, we ran this as an idea, and it's a very good idea. And we should give the money to the housing associations to build new houses. Fine, happy with that. But we should actually, again, extend the rights of house ownership, home ownership, to the, not the poorest, but the near poorest in our society, the least well off. A property-owning democracy is the best way to ensure that everyone has a stake in society. The best way, bluntly, to see off the next wave of Corbyn promises. Of course, to buy a house, you have to have a job. One of the great successes of the last 8 years has been employment creation. We have more people in work than ever before, and the lowest unemployment for a generation. Lowest unemployment in my adult lifetime. It's an astonishing achievement. Unfortunately, a large number of those jobs are not as well paid as we would wish. Now, some of this is the direct outcome of large immigration numbers. When employers have the choice of an almost infinite supply of well-motivated, highly motivated labour, then they are not going to spend money on training or money on investment, productivity-increasing investment. And understand, if I were a Pole, or if I were Romanian, or if I were any other Eastern European, I would be in Britain too, determined to make my money, to build my house back home, to support my mother, or whatever it is done. that they intend to do. But the effect on our economy is that of actually reducing the growth in productivity. If you're an employer and you don't spend money on training and you don't spend money on labour saving, what happens to productivity? It's flattened or even goes down. But our productivity policy has got to be much more than that. It's not just about migration control. We are a hugely innovative nation, and we need to be ready for what is, in effect, a second industrial revolution. In terms of massive changes in technology and huge opportunities in the global market. This is, of course, what Brexit is all about. But it also has enormous domestic implications. Now, I'm optimistic for the future. We're a great country, and our best days are ahead of us. Once we powered the Industrial Revolution, and cottage industries were transformed into factories. Now, we're almost seeing the opposite effect. Technology is seeing the advance of a new state-of-the-art small enterprises, modern distribution systems, modern production processes, and modern markets all mean that small businesses can be much more successful, whether manufacturing or software or various other sorts of virtual businesses. We're seeing the rise of what's called the long tail. There's a book about this. This is a strategy that allows businesses that realize significant profit out of selling low volumes of hard-to-find items to many customers, instead of only selling the old industrial model, vast numbers of similar items to a large number of customers. More and smaller enterprises will develop niche and bespoke products. The economy of the future will see mega corporations cheek by jowl with micro businesses and conventional labour alongside the gig economy. It's these young, innovative, disruptive companies that have brought us driverless cars, artificial intelligence, and cleaner energy. Exciting new technologies will continue to transform the world and improve human welfare. We need a new economic ecosystem that nurtures the innovative and enterprising, and we need to aid the young companies stepping up to becoming the new Googles and Amazons of the world. This does not just mean smarter and lighter regulation, but a fairer and lighter tax system. The UK's tax burden is higher than the G7 average, higher than it's been for a very long time, and many of our global competitors too. We know from history that lower taxes lead to higher revenues and a stronger economy. One of the great virtues of the Thatcher years, and you had, I know, Nigel Lawson here last year, who is the champion of this. One of the great virtues of the Thatcher years is we demonstrated in terms that you cut the rate of tax, you increase the take of tax. You actually deliver a higher, stronger, higher delivering, faster, stronger economy, and at the same time, you get a better return. Freedom works. Thatcherism demonstrated that. That's how a Conservative government ought to be funding its future commitments. Now, Margaret Thatcher would have encouraged the rise of small entrepreneurs and enterprises. She would have used the power of the state to enable capitalism to flourish, and which is what we should do in the coming years. Now, at this point, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to make a confession. It's a confession about telling a fib. Many years ago, I made up a story about Margaret Thatcher. It was such a successful story that it made its way around every Conservative association in the country. Such a successful story that David Cameron stole it for his valedictory on Margaret Thatcher in the House of Commons after she died. The story goes something like this. I was walking through the members' lobby of the House of Commons, and I bumped into a friend of mine called Michael Forsyth. He'd just been made a brand new minister. This was back in '87, brand new minister. And he was rushing across the lobby, hair awry, face red, sweating, bundle of papers under one arm, ministerial box under the other, desperate hurry. And as he ran past, I said, "Slow down, Michael. Rome wasn't built in a day, you know." And without breaking step, he says, "Maybe not, but Margaret Thatcher wasn't the foreman on that job, was she?" Well, the story's not true. It ought to be true, but it's not true. But tonight I can confess that point. But the simple fact is, it ought to be true. It sort of is true in terms of as parables are true. She was the foreman on a job which delivered the most spectacular change and transformation in a country. It demonstrated to us all what a single individual can do. What a single individual can do. What leadership can do. What drive and conviction and courage can do. And that's what conservatism today is about. We are sort of, yet again, an unfashionable creed. We have a philosophy that works. We have a belief system that works. We have a view of society which was true for the last 200 years, but what I'm seeing now convinces me will be true for the next 200 years. Because all those things I've just been saying about mega corporations and micro businesses, how will they work best? They'll work best when we have a society in which they're free to do what they're best at. When the state takes away the least amount of money from them. When they have the right to go out and give to the ordinary people what the ordinary people want. Not what the state says, not what the state wants to encourage, but what ordinary people want. When I was a very young man, and the IEA and organizations like it were resistance organizations, and Thatcherism was a sort of new, bright, shining idea. In those days, we had to fight hard against the collectivist viewpoint. And yet we won. And why did we win? Because our ideas worked and the other side's ideas failed. Whether it was in Britain in 1979, when the country was rife with strikes and when our productivity was disastrous and we were going to the IMF for a loan, or whether it's in the Soviet Union, when eventually, after a long, brave stand by Thatcher and Reagan together, it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. That's what conservatism is about. That's what Thatcherism is about. And the point about Brexit, and I said I wasn't talking about Brexit, but I've got off script, so I am going to now. The point about Brexit is it's a liberation. It is a release. It's a freedom. Between about 1980 and about 1984, I had a very peculiar personal experiment. I left the country for a few years to go to Canada. When I left, I was a finance director of a company, and I went round to look at how my co-directors were doing. And I looked at the diary of the production director in the company I worked in to see what he did all week. And this production director, whose job, remember, was improving the quality of the product, developing new products, cutting the costs, increasing the output, all those things, 80% of his week disappeared in employment tribunals, disciplinary hearings, negotiations with the trade union, etc., councils, trade councils, and the rest. 80% of it. So he basically ran the company on about 10 hours a week. Came back a few years later, different company, but I went to see a company which actually all it made was blast furnace nozzles. A very exotic product, very, very mundane product, actually. And I was going around and looking at what they were doing, and I said to the production director, how much of your time do you spend on labour relations matters? Oh, a couple of hours a week. That's the difference. That was the difference in 3 years. But what was even bigger than that difference was not just being liberated from the things which were wasting time rather than doing a job. Because after all, the 80% of the time that the original production director worked on wasn't actually improving industrial relations, wasn't improving the welfare of the workers, all of which I approve of. It was just taking time. It went through to a company which was making their workers wealthier by being more successful, competing with everybody from Britain to India. So that was one element of it. But the other element of it was not just a technical transformation, not just a change in trade union law, not just a change in taxes, not just a change in the exchange rate controls and all those sorts of things that Mrs. Thatcher and Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson did in those days. It was something else. It was a revolution in expectations. It was a sudden growth of belief in ourselves. And this country has really got no reason to believe we are as good as we are. We're 60 million people. What's that, 1% of the world's population? And yet we are powerful. We're the 5th biggest economy. We have reach beyond belief. We are a leading member. We're on the UN Security Council. We're a leading member of the Commonwealth, a leading member of the NATO. But more than that, 1.5 billion, a quarter of the world, talk our language. The language English, the language of Shakespeare and Faraday and Newton and all the rest of it, but also the language of science, of international law, of the internet, if you can count American media. All of these things. We have the most fabulous chance in life. Why? Not because we're all brilliant, not because we are, I'm sure you all are, but not because of our innate talent in itself, but because the institutional DNA of our country. We have the best institutional DNA of any country in the world. Our constitution, our legal system, as I say, our language, our belief in freedom. I used to say, if freedom was a disease, the English language would be the vector. So this is what we are. This is why we should be utterly confident in our future. This is why Brexit, to come back to the subject, this is why Brexit is so important, because it's going to let us grasp our own destiny and make the most of it, not just for you and me, but most importantly, for our children and grandchildren. Thank you very much.